72 days stranded on a frozen mountainside, starving, snowblind, and forced to break the ultimate taboo to survive. It sounds impossible, but this isn't fiction. This is the true survival story of an Andes plane crash so astounding that it's forever known as the miracle in the Andes. A routine flight turned into a nightmare entrapment on an icy glacier, where a group of young men defied death in ways the world could scarcely imagine. They were ordinary athletes and friends, not adventurers braced for catastrophe. How did a fun trip to a rugby match descend into 72 days of frozen hell? And what unimaginable choices enabled these survivors to cling to life against all odds? To understand the miracle that unfolded high in the Andes, we must start at the very beginning, with a crash that no one was ever supposed to survive. It all began on October 12, 1972. A Uruguayan amateur rugby team, the Old Christians Club, chartered a Fairchild FH-227D aircraft to fly from Montevideo, Uruguay to Santiago, Chile for a friendly match. On board were 45 people, teammates, friends, family members, and crew, all in high spirits. As they took off on Friday the 13th, the young rugby players cracked jokes about the unlucky date, never dreaming how prophetic that jest would become. The crash. High over the rugged Andes, bad weather forced the pilots to divert south and then turn back north toward Chile. Believing they had cleared the highest peaks, the crew began to descend, but they were terribly mistaken. At 3:30 p.m. on October 13th, the unthinkable happened. The plane grazed a mountainside, shearing off one wing, then the other, before careening down a remote valley enveloped in snow. Inside the cabin, seats ripped from the floor and hurtled forward as the fuselage hurtled down the slope. When the mangled metal finally skidded to a halt, silence and shock fell over the survivors. Of the 45 people on board, 12 were killed instantly in the crash. The cockpit was crushed like tin foil. The pilots did not survive. In the torn cabin, those left alive slowly realized their predicament. 33 survivors crawled from the wreckage onto a barren glacier at 11,500 feet elevation, a world of ice and rock with thin air and night temperatures plummeting to 30 degrees below zero. Dazed and injured, they huddled in the shattered fuselage for any scrap of shelter. Some made makeshift walls from suitcases and debris to block the bitter wind. As daylight faded on that first horrific day, the group of mostly teenage and 20-something boys did the only thing they could. They clung to one another for warmth, praying that rescue would come by morning. But morning brought no rescue. Over the next days, the survivors tended to their wounded and took stock of their scant supplies. Among them was 22-year-old Fernando "Nando" Parado, who had been knocked unconscious in the crash and lay in a coma for 3 days. When Nando finally awoke, he was surrounded by the clear, beautiful faces of friends, relieved he was alive. But he soon learned his mother had died in the crash, and his 19-year-old sister Susie was gravely injured, unable to move. Nando spent that first night by her side, melting snow in his mouth to drip water into her lips. All around, others suffered broken bones and deep cuts. Nando's close friend Roberto Canessa, a medical student, assumed a lead role in caring for the injured, improvising splints and encouraging those in shock. Each passing hour was a balancing act between hope and despair. By day 8 of their ordeal, young Susie, Nando's beloved sister, succumbed to her injuries and died in his arms. One by one, others also slipped away in those early days from wounds that were just too severe. The survivors' count fell further, and with it, their hearts. Still, those remaining refused to surrender to grief just yet. They focused on survival, doing whatever they could to stay alive until rescuers arrived. On the frozen mountainside, there was no vegetation and no animals to hunt, just endless snow. The group's entire food supply amounted to a few chocolate bars, some crackers and jam, a bit of dried fruit, and a couple of bottles of wine. Even with strict rationing, 1 nibble of chocolate per person, sips of wine, and melted snow for water, within a week, these meager provisions were completely gone. Desperation grew. Some boys tried stuffing their stomachs with pieces of shredded airplane seat foam or strips of leather from luggage to no avail. Their bodies were consuming themselves. Starvation had become a very real and lethal threat. As hunger gnawed and their bellies ached hollowly, an unspeakable idea crept into their conversations. Nando, gaunt and weak, took 3 days just to eat a single chocolate-covered peanut. He knew this couldn't continue. Late one evening, roughly a week after the crash, Nando turned to a friend and spoke the words no one wanted to say aloud. They could eat the flesh of those who had died. Human meat. It was an unthinkable taboo solution, but it might be the only way to avoid slow, certain death. When this proposal was brought to the group, it sparked an agonizing debate that lasted all through the day. These were devout young men, many raised Catholic. The idea of cannibalism horrified them. A few flatly refused at first, but others pointed out a grim truth. Their friends who had perished no longer needed their bodies, but the living did. Several of those who died had been among the strongest and healthiest. Their stored fat and muscle could literally fuel the others' survival. Some survivors tearfully pledged their own bodies to the group if they themselves should die, viewing it as an offering of life rather than a desecration. In a way, it was like the ultimate sacrifice of friendship. One survivor later said, "We donated our bodies. You could die, and you could help the others to live." Finally, as hunger and hopelessness mounted, most of the group made a pact. They would do the unthinkable to survive, and the souls of their lost friends would surely understand. They waited for the right moment, hearts pounding with dread and resolve. Then came another crushing blow. On the 11th day, through a static crackling transistor radio that survivor Roy Harley had coaxed into working, they heard the news they feared most. The official search for them had been called off. The outside world had given them up for dead. Sobs of despair echoed in the fuselage as this news sank in. If rescue wasn't coming, survival was now entirely up to them. That same day, with grim determination, the survivors set aside the last shreds of taboo. A small team used broken glass from the wreck to carefully cut strips of flesh from the bodies of their fallen friends, which had been preserved in the snow outside. Trembling hands brought the first slivers of frozen flesh to their lips. They prayed for forgiveness, some recalling the scripture, "This is my body which is given for you." In their minds, it was an act of necessity and even of love, a final gift from the deceased that would keep their companions alive. One reluctant young man closed his eyes and told himself he was taking communion. In that moment, the taboo was broken. They would live at least a little longer by consuming the only nourishment the mountain provided, the bodies of their own friends. Life on the glacier. Sustained by this macabre diet, the remaining survivors persisted through the end of October. They endured indescribable routine hardships, nights of bone-cracking cold where they woke with frost in their hair, days of blinding sun off the snow that burned their skin and snow blistered their lips. To stave off hypothermia, they punched each other's arms to keep blood flowing and huddled so closely that they could feel the rise and fall of each other's chests. All the while, they kept the faith that somehow, someday, they would be found, or perhaps they could find a way out themselves. By late October, over 2 weeks in, 27 people remained alive. Some of the strongest, Nando, Roberto, and a few others nicknamed the Expeditionaries, began scouting possible escape routes during brief breaks in the weather. They knew their location was so remote that hiking out might be the only way to alert the world. But every attempt to climb the steep surrounding peaks was thwarted by altitude sickness and knee-deep powder. They improvised snowshoes from airplane insulation and cushions strapped to their feet, only to turn back each time, exhausted and snowblind. Each failure drove home the despair of their isolation. They were utterly alone in a vast white wilderness. Still, Nando kept one thought burning in his mind. His father was waiting for him, thinking him dead, and Nando refused to let his father lose his entire family. Then, on October 29th, just as the group was clinging to a fragile routine, tragedy struck again. In the dead of night, a low rumble rose in the distance, growing into a thunder. Before anyone could react, a massive avalanche roared down the mountain and engulfed the fuselage. Snow blasted through every gap, instantly burying the sleeping survivors under a suffocating blanket. Those who weren't crushed struggled in darkness, entombed by snow packed tight as cement. Nando was pinned, unable to move, barely able to breathe. Around him, muffled cries and panicked shouts filled the pitch-black cabin. By sheer luck, one alert survivor, Roy Harley, had leapt to his feet when he heard the avalanche coming and thus wasn't completely buried. Roy clawed his way toward faint voices, digging air holes to free a few companions, who in turn dug out others. In the frantic minutes and hours that followed, they managed to pull several people from the snow, saving many who would have suffocated. Even so, of the 27 people who had huddled in the fuselage, 8 were dead by the time the avalanche settled. The survivors were now reduced to 19, and in a cruel twist, they were trapped even worse than before. The fuselage was completely buried in snow, only a tiny air pocket remained inside. They hacked a small hole through the roof with a metal pole to get oxygen, but for 3 long days the blizzard raged on outside, forcing them to wait in darkness next to the bodies of their friends who had just perished. Hell would have been a comfortable place compared to those days under the avalanche, one survivor quipped grimly later. Finally, when the storm abated, the survivors dug their way out of the snowy tomb, crawling back onto the surface of the glacier into blinding daylight. They were alive, but battered psychologically and physically. If there had been any remaining hope that staying put and waiting might lead to rescue, it was now gone. They realized with dread certainty that the only way off this mountain would be on their own 2 feet. In the following weeks, the 16 men still alive, 3 more had died from their injuries and the punishing conditions in the avalanche's aftermath, devoted themselves to a single goal: escape. They waited for late spring weather to improve and used every ounce of ingenuity to prepare for a desperate trek. The clothing they had was utterly inadequate, so they layered whatever they could scavenge, multiple sweaters, jeans, and socks wrapped in plastic to ward off the brutal cold. They crafted snowshoes and a crude sleeping bag by stitching insulation and spare cloth from the plane seats. Nando noticed his belt had no notches left. He had lost so much weight that he'd punched new holes all the way to the end, a stark signal that time was running out. They had to leave before their bodies failed. This would be their final gamble, a do-or-die march out of the Andes to find help. On the morning of December 12, 1972, day 61 of their ordeal, the expedition finally began. Nando Parado, Roberto Canessa, and Antonio Tintin Vizintin volunteered to venture forth, carrying the hopes of all 16 survivors on their backs. Their plan was simple but daunting: climb over the nearest mountain peak, believing Chile lay just beyond, then hike down to civilization. Before setting off, the 3 young men shared a solemn moment with the others. Nando turned to his remaining friends in the fuselage and promised, "I will come back. I'm going to bring help." He also made a heartbreaking offer. If food ran out, those left behind could consume his share of their friends, including Nando's own mother and sister, whose bodies still remained in the snow. It was his way of saying he'd sacrifice anything to ensure the group's survival. With tears, embraces, and a last look at their makeshift camp on the glacier, the 3 trudged off into the unknown, disappearing up the steep incline. Climbing at over 3,500 meters altitude, 12,000 plus feet, with improvised gear, would test them to the limit. The thin air made each step a labor. Experts would later note that one should only gain a few hundred meters of elevation per day at such heights, but these determined friends climbed twice that in a single morning. Under a merciless sun, they scrambled upward, lungs burning, legs trembling. By afternoon, altitude sickness hit hard. Nando's heart raced uncontrollably, and Roberto became dizzy and nauseated. The trio had planned to reach the summit by sundown on day 1, but that goal proved wildly optimistic. It actually took 3 grueling days to scale the peak that loomed above their crash site. Every night, they huddled together in their precious sleeping bag under the open sky, temperatures plunging well below zero. On the first night, the cold was so extreme that their plastic water bottles shattered from the freezing temperatures. Still, they pressed on, driven by the image of green valleys presumably just beyond the summit. On the 3rd day of climbing, Nando finally staggered to the top of the mountain ahead of the others. He stood at 4,650 meters, 15,000 feet, expecting to gaze down at the lush foothills of Chile and the end of their nightmare. Instead, as he looked out, his heart dropped. In every direction lay only endless jagged mountains, peak after snowy peak. The crash site was far deeper in the Andes than they realized. Chile was not just one ridge away, it was many mountains away. "We thought we were maybe 5 kilometers from help," Nando later said, but it was more like 80. For a moment, atop that summit, their last hope seemed to evaporate. Exhausted and starving after days of climbing, how could they possibly cross dozens more miles of forbidding wilderness? Nando slumped down to wait for Roberto and Tintin to reach the top. In that pivotal moment, he faced a choice: give up and turn back, essentially a death sentence for all of them, or push forward into the unknown. When Roberto Canessa crawled up to the summit and saw the same disheartening panorama, he nearly broke down. But Nando refused to let despair win. He looked at Roberto and spoke firmly: "If we go back, we die. We've come this far. We must keep going." Nando's resolve ignited Roberto's. They decided on the spot that Tintin, who was weaker and consuming precious food, should return to the fuselage with the news that the journey would be longer than expected. They gave him a share of their remaining meat and even fashioned a sled so he could slide downhill, back to the others. Tintin would make it back in just 1 hour. Nando and Roberto, now alone, forged ahead westward with nothing but snow-capped peaks on the horizon, fully aware that it was a near-suicidal gamble. "This is a kamikaze expedition," Nando had said, acknowledging that they might not return, but it was a risk they had to take. For 10 harrowing days, Parado and Canessa trekked through the Andes. Each day they awoke on frigid bare ground, their bodies skeletal and weary, and willed themselves to continue. As they descended from the highest altitudes, the landscape gradually began to change. The eternal white of the glacier gave way to patches of brown earth. Then came a miraculous sight: green grass and even a few grazing cows on distant slopes. These signs of civilization spurred them on. They followed a river downstream, reasoning that it would lead to people. Sure enough, on December 20th, as the two staggered along a riverbank, they spotted humans on the far side of a roaring river. 3 Chilean herdsmen on horseback. Nando and Roberto were so weak they could barely shout over the torrent. They jumped and waved, trying to convey their desperation. The astonished muleteers across the river could see these wild-looking strangers calling to them, but the rush of water drowned out the words. Finally, one of the men found a pencil and paper, wrapped them around a rock, and threw it across the river. Roberto scribbled a brief message and hurled it back. "I come from a plane that fell in the mountains." That now famous note was the first confirmation the outside world would have of the survivors' existence. Reading it, the herdsman Sergio Catalan realized with a shock who these men must be: the long-lost rugby players from the news. With darkness falling, Catalan shouted that he would ride to get help and return in the morning. Before leaving, the kind Chileans tossed pieces of bread across the river to the emaciated men. For Nando and Roberto, after 10 days of walking and 72 days of starvation, those crusts of bread tasted like heaven. True to his word, the next day, December 21st, Sergio Catalan returned, now accompanied by police and mountain rescue officials. The ordeal was almost over. The 2 survivors guided the authorities toward the crash site's location as best they could describe. On December 22nd, 1972, rescue helicopters finally located the remaining survivors on the mountain. Down on the glacier, the 14 men who had stayed behind had nearly given up hope of ever seeing Nando and Roberto again. Then, around midday, a thunderous noise signaled the approach of helicopters. One of the boys ran out of the broken fuselage, waving a bright yellow sleeping bag. The pilots spotted movement on that snowfield, and to the survivors' astonishment, a helicopter began to descend. After 72 days, help had arrived. When the first helicopter touched down on the makeshift helipad stomped in the snow, Nando was on board, leading the rescue team. As he jumped out, 3 of his closest friends, barefoot and skeletal but alive, rushed from the wreckage and pounced on him in joy, smothering him in hugs and grateful kisses. It was a scene of overwhelming emotion, the kind of euphoria few on Earth have ever experienced. After 10 weeks on the brink of death, they were saved. Due to weight limits in the extreme altitude, only half of the survivors could be airlifted out at a time. Nando insisted on staying until the last trip. The first group of 6 was flown to a hospital in San Fernando, Chile, and the remaining 8 spent one final night on the mountain, now accompanied by rescuers who fed and warmed them, before they too were lifted to safety on December 23rd. Against all odds, 16 of the 45 people on that flight had survived. They had endured 72 days on a glacier through sheer willpower, teamwork, and a little bit of miracle. The snowbound boys of the Andes were going home, The ordeal of Flight 571 was over, but the story was far from finished. As the survivors recovered in hospitals, the world learned of their astounding tale and latched on to one shocking detail above all: they had survived by eating the flesh of their dead. When this truth emerged, sensational headlines splashed across newspapers worldwide. Some reporters crudely dubbed them cannibals without grasping the context. There was public curiosity and even outrage from those who didn't understand the desperation of life and death. But the young men, in interviews, calmly explained the impossible position they'd been in. One survivor plainly stated, "The only food were the bodies of those who died, so we ate them." They emphasized how they had all agreed it was an act of survival and that their friends-turned-food had essentially given their lives twice, once in dying and again in sustaining the living. In a deeply Catholic country like Uruguay, this could have sparked moral scandal. Yet the Catholic Church stood by the survivors, officially declaring that, given the extremity of the circumstances, no sin had been committed by consuming human flesh. A priest likened it to the biblical Last Supper. Just as Jesus offered his body to save others, these boys had been saved by the bodies of their friends. This perspective helped many understand the terrible necessity behind the taboo. Families of the deceased also offered their forgiveness and love, recognizing that their lost sons and daughters would have wanted the team to live. Over time, the initial shock gave way to awe at the sheer resilience and unity the group had shown. The 16 survivors themselves were suddenly thrust into fame. They returned to a hero's welcome in Uruguay, and for months they were swarmed by journalists and well-wishers. Emaciated almost beyond recognition, Nando had lost 45 kilograms, approximately 100 pounds, and looked like skin and bones. They slowly regained their strength. Many had frostbite, malnutrition, and lingering injuries to recover from, but all of them survived the rehabilitation. Psychologically, some feared they'd be haunted by nightmares or guilt. But remarkably, most of them, like Nando, later reported that they did not suffer lasting trauma or remorse for what they had done to survive. They had looked death in the face and made peace with it on that mountain. What remained was a profound gratitude for life. As Nando put it years later, "Every time I breathe, it's like a miracle. I shouldn't be here." In the years that followed, the survivors formed a lifelong bond. More than teammates or friends, truly brothers who shared a second birth. They even created a foundation that encouraged organ donation, inspired by their experience of giving life to one another. Each year on December 22nd, the group gathers with their families to celebrate what they call their second birthday, honoring the day they were rescued and remembering those who did not return. A simple iron cross stands in the Andes at the site of the crash, a memorial to the 29 souls who perished there. The survivors have all visited it, laying to rest the memories of their friends in that place where life, death, sacrifice, and hope became eternally intertwined. In the end, the miracle in the Andes is far more than a tale of cannibalism or tragedy. It's a story of the indomitable human spirit. 16 young men survived the unsurvivable by banding together in courage, faith, and unwavering determination. They emerged from that glacier not as victims, but as living proof that even in the most desperate circumstances, humanity can find a way to endure. Their story asks us to consider the unthinkable decisions one might make when pushed to the absolute brink, and it shows that sometimes hope can ignite from the darkest places. Even now, decades later, the survivors will tell you they are not heroes or superhuman. They were ordinary people who simply refused to let go of life. As Nando Parado reflects, he doesn't live in the shadow of those 72 days, but he carries their lessons always, that every additional day alive is a gift, and that the bonds of friendship and family can give you strength you never knew you had. The miracle in the Andes stands as an emotionally powerful reminder of how precious life is. It's a true survival story that continues to inspire and humble all who hear it. Thank you for watching. If this incredible journey moved you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more true stories of human resilience. Together, let's honor these survivors' legacy by treasuring the value of life and the power of hope. Until next time, stay inspired and take care of one another.